Okay, so I'm taking charge from now. I hope everyone is with me. My name is Dr. Manal Totry-Jubran. I'm from the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Good evening, everyone. So welcome to the last workshop or session for this extraordinary conference. I must say that I have learned a lot during these 3 days. And so before we begin, I just want to thank the organizers for their efforts in putting together this unusual gathering. And the topic of our session is multiculturalism, religion, gender, and law, part 2, a continuing from part 1 from yesterday. And we have very promising and young researchers that will each present her presentation in 15 minutes, and then we will have a response of 10 minutes. After the presentations, we will have enough time, I think, for discussion and questions. And since we are not in a webinar setting, you can either write your question down in the chat, or you can ask the participants directly. We'll see how it goes. So I will present each speaker as we go along, and I will start with Dr. Salwa Alenat Abed, who is a historian. She's a lecturer and a researcher at the Open University and a postdoctoral student at Tel Aviv University. Her research focuses on religious female identities and political Islam. Please, everyone, just make sure that you are muted and stay muted until we finish the session of the 5 presentations, and then I will give you the chance to respond or to ask. Salwa will talk about Salwa's presentation is titled "Two or More Faces of the Same Coin: The Struggle of Religious Muslim Women for Their Identity in a Complex Israeli Reality." So Salwa, you have 15 minutes. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the last section. It was very, mashir, many thoughts and many ideas. Okay, so I will talk about another case study in Israel. So I will share my presentation. Okay. Iman Khatib is the first religious Muslim woman who successfully became a Knesset member of the Islamic movement in 2019. She was an activist, not only in the Islamic movement, but also in Arab Palestinian feminist organizations. She cleverly took advantage of exponential conditions in the Islamic movement and unusual Israeli elections times, 3 times of elections in less than 2 years. And we are also going to the for election. So what are the strategies and the principles that lead Iman Khatib and other Muslim religious activists in Israel? I'm talking now especially on, about activists on the Islamic movement in Israel. I will try to answer this question in my talk. I will talk about their strategies and their principles. My interest lies in researching circles of identities of Muslim activists as a woman, as Palestinian nationals in non-Palestinian country, and as a religious Muslim women who live in non-Muslim country, and they are also under Israeli influences. I think Sarab Aburabia and Nahid Ashkar talk a lot about that, so I will not repeat what they said in the last section. I want to mention that according to the statistics, the Arab Palestinian minority are only 21% of the population in Israel. And the Islamic movement is one of the main political and social players in Arab Palestinian society. Women played and still playing a very important role in the movement and in the society. In effect, there were 4 stages of the development of formal female activism within the Islamic movement in Israel. The activists themselves termed the first stage the glorious one, the glorious stage. It's lasted from the beginning of the 80s until the split of the Islamic movement, which happened in 96. During this stage, activists are committed to dawah, which means inviting or encouraging the imperance of Islam. They devoted all their time to dawah. The second stage began in 96 when the Islamic movement split into northern and southern factions. During this stage, the activists in each faction become very involved in the communities that identified with that faction, and there also were competition between the two factions. And the third stage is, started in 2000s, and this stage is characterized by the institutionalization of each of the movement's factions. And they did this by creating non-profit organizations run by more veteran activists. The fourth stage began in 2008 with the academization of activists in both factions. By academization, I mean that at this stage, students and graduates of Israeli academic institutions began joining as activists. They are highly educated women who are searching for a safe framework within the Israeli academic sphere to express their Islamic identity. In 2015, I have to mention that Israeli government forbade the activities of the northern factions, and that have a large influence on the female activists, but I will not deal with that. I want to focus on the Muslim religious female activists in Israel and their strategies as a part of the Islamic movement for dealing with the reality of living in Israeli environment. As you know, it's very complicated environment. Well, first of all, I want to show you what there are attitudes are to Israel. It's very important. If we know their attitudes, we can learn and understand more about their strategies. Well, I did a study of religious Muslim women in Israel between 2010 and 2015. I interviewed about 50 female activists in the Islamic movement. And here's some of the information from the data I obtained. As you see, 66% of the activists wanted to integrate into Israeli society. 23% reject the Israeli state, and 11% didn't wish to openly discuss their opinion regarding the Israeli setting. Okay, it's very interesting, those attitudes, but it showed us that there is several approaches to the Israeli society. I want to talk about the strategies to connect these attitudes to the strategies and to the religious principles, so we can see that there are matching, coordinating between the attitudes and the religious principles and the strategies. So I will show you first of all, the strategies and then the principles, and then you will understand that this is connected to their attitudes. So I will tell you now about 6 main areas of struggles. Maybe there are more, but I will focus on them. First of all, education and dawah. Okay, activists are increasing both religious and secular education secular education opens the doors for them to work and to improve their conditions in Israel. Religious education empowers them as da'iyat, preachers for Islam in their society. By 2000, the number of female preachers that had both formal and informal education was increasing. Now, there is no statistics, but we are talking about hundreds of women with different, levels of education, but they are da'iyat. They are very involved in their society. And the da'wah, as you see here in this picture, da'wah is carried out in many ways, formally and informally, in holy places like this picture from Al-Aqsa Masjid in Jerusalem. Here is also a lesson for da'wah or for Islamic, telling more about Islamic and Islamic rule of women. And also another ways of da'wah through Facebook, face-to-face, and in Corona time also by Zoom. Most of the activists believe that in the integration approach, where there is no contradiction between Islam and Israeli law, they see Israel as multicultural environment. Okay, the next one is visibility in the public sphere. You talk about hijab. There's many messages that hijab can express, but women of the Islamic movement see hijab is a tool, or is a tool in order to strengthen the religious identity in a secular area. Especially, I'm talking about especially students, Muslim students in Israeli university. They feel that they need the hijab in order to feel secure, feel بتخاط יותר, or Alenat, feel safe. And the other one is a new interpretation of Islamic legacy and the holy texts. In recent years, the activists of the Islamic movement have been trying to deal with feminism in general and Islamic feminist theories and practices in particular. Nahid mentioned the Nisa wa Afaq, Women and Horizon, and the ideas of this organization is also discussed by the Islamic movement and by the activists in the Islamic movement. And they have done, they deal with the Islamic feminism, and they have done that by redefining the Islamic women's place and rules according to Islam. In one hand, they accept the criticism of social norms that women, Muslim women are under. They deal with a problematic situation, but they didn't accept the criticism about Islamic law. Okay, the fourth way for them is the absence from formal politics. And, I have here a question mark, because most of the activists prefer not to be on the stage. They prefer to be active behind the scenes because they believe that is more hishma or afaf, or they can get more the al-ajr fil akhirah, they can be awarded by Allah if they hide their activities. Some of them have avoid being part of political game due to social and political reasons. I must, however, mention Iman Khatib. She is in the middle of this photo. Okay, she is the Knesset member. Okay. She is, I think, is a unique case because she became a Knesset member, but the other women around her become, invisible because they are not on the stage. Okay, they support her, but are not on the stage, and they didn't succeed to participate in elections, for example, in municipality elections. So we are talking about playing a part or playing a role in the formal politics. And the fifth way of that female Muslim activists try to spread their message is by ribat at al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Ribat, there are many meanings of ribat, but we are now talking about ribat as a prayer, as being at al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and to provocate, in order to provocate the Israeli authority. I call that the policy of provocacy. And it's very interesting, but I cannot, maybe in the question, I can more talk about this strategy, but they want to show Israel that they didn't accept the Israeli authority. And this, I think, this strategy is connected to the attitudes of some of the female activists that they deny and they didn't accept the Israeli authority. And finally, we can talk about activists who are engaged in dialogue with religious Jewish women. In recent years, some activists have met with religious women, Jewish women, and men in order to understand, first of all, how a Jewish female live according to Judaism, okay, to learn about the experience of Jewish women, and also they discuss political issues like Masjid al-Aqsa and all the issues that they are related to their political and religious identities. So I present now the strategy. I want to talk now about the principles. I find out there are three main religious principles that help Muslim women to deal with the Israeli complicated environment. Okay, they negotiate with their surroundings, they strive to be active and to present their identity as a legitimate identity under the Israeli system. The first principle is called musayara, coordinating, or matching. This principle allows them to follow with the exciting reality and not to have to fight it to survive within it. The activists didn't mention this strategy directly, but it may be understood from their statements that they may seek to integrate into the society by this principle. The second one is tawriya, hiding, which means that the Muslim women prefer not to confront with the Israeli system to save their religious identity. Within those two principles, no matter to which faction they belong, they are striving to spread their message to other members of their society. Then the third principle, bara, which means rejecting, it means that Muslim women reject Israeli culture and deal with the Israeli as a colonial state. So I think that it's now more clear for you that the strategies and the principles are also connected to their attitude that I showed you before. We can see that the strategies of women who want to integrate, they have dialogue with Israeli Jewish women, they participate in the political game, okay? And women who prefer not to integrate with the Israeli society or reject the Israeli society, they are more in ribat in Masjid al-Aqsa. Okay, so in the highlight of those strategies, I want to connect that with the agency. Amina would talk about it, also Sarab Aburabia talk about it, and I want to expand the significance of agency that Saba Mahmoud also offered in her research about Egyptian religious Muslim and their activities in the 90s. Agency is...
Salwa, please,
yes.
Can you start concluding your past the 15 minutes? Thank you.
Yes, I will sum up. Okay, agency is defined as the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. By contrast, social, political, and economic structure are those factors that limit women from being their own agent and making their own decisions. Mahmoud showed us that liberalization, individual interests, and freedom from religious restrictions are not necessarily the ideal aims or values for religious women. According to Mahmoud, or what I understand from Mahmoud, religious women have their agency, but it's different from feminist secular women, and this is legitimate. In this light of this agency, I understand Musayara, Tawriya, and Bara as a principle that expresses the free will of the activist according to Islam. Muslim religious women in Israel of the Islamic movement, because Nahid talk about another kind or a group of Muslim women, they use those principles in order to reconstruct their agency, not only for themselves, but also for other religious women and men in Israel. And we can learn more by using these principles in the women experiences in other societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salwa, for the very interesting and enriching presentation. I have some questions, but I will leave it until we go to the question part. Our next speaker is Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy. Cochav is an expert on international law, human rights, and feminist legal theory. She holds a SJD and LLM with distinction honors from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Her work focuses on women's belief, liberties, and transformative equality, and she is the founding head of the Deborah Institute for Research and Innovation, which centers on transformational gender equality, sustainable development, and future challenges. She is also currently a visiting professor at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law. So, Cochav, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manal. It is truly a pleasure to be here today in this wonderful and enriching conference. I think we planned it for so long, so it's great to see it finally happening and to have a chance to listen and engage with such an amazing group of scholars, which I truly honor and respect. I would like to begin by reading a quote of Miss Zaina Anwar, which I assume you all know, in her opening speech at 2009 Historic Global Conference in Kuala Lumpur to launch her organization Musawa, the global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. And this is what she said. And I can say it as well as her, of course. We are activists, academics, policy makers, members of parliament, judges, professionals, all leaders, all shakers and movers with the courage of our convictions to demand and create a better life and a better world. Who says Muslim women are oppressed, discriminated, silenced, and victimized? We are not, and we refuse to be. We show equality is possible within religion. We come together to think, to feel, to question what it means to be as Muslim in the 21st century. A similar quote, I could take a lot of quotes from the past few days. I will just mention a similar quote, quest for new thinking and spirit of innovation animates also in the words of Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza from the Harvard Divinity School, spoke from this very conference and said, I'm often asked, with whom did you study feminist theology? And an unfailingly answer, when I published my book, Feminist Theology and Feminist Studies in Religion did not yet exist. Hence, we had to invent them. Other feminist religious scholars here in this conference and beyond it express and follow a similar quest. the quest to reimagine the rules, the quest that I would like to suggest is a path to transformational gender equality. I will talk to you today about this power of invention, this unfailing commitment to challenge the rules upon which our society operates, as I believe has transformational implications not only to liberalize religious communities and energize feminist movements, but also to impact society at large. I will share with you today my research over the past few years on women's belief liberties, as much as I will be able to, feminist religious movements, and on the global commitment to gender equality. And then I will tie everything to my work today and main research focused over the past 4 years on transformative equality as expressed in the title of this lecture. So I have been truly fortunate to have studied the work of feminist religious women for the past decade, as well as feminist theories and global human rights institutions. I devoured the work of feminist scholars and activists and found so much inspiration, powerful, brave actions, and fierce objection to accept reality as it is, whether it means to challenge family laws, to follow a certain practice that appears radical, to question long-standing traditional truth. They motivated significant reforms around the world. The research that I conducted at Penn Law delved deep into the development and essence of the idea of gender equality in international law, as well as into the complex matrix of factors affecting women as members in diverse religious groups around the world. As my work progressed, I found significant foundational gaps. Indeed, the global struggle for gender equality has led to one of the most effective societal transformation we've seen. Women's right to work, to acquire education, to vote, to attend political positions, essentially to be treated as full human beings, have been widely recognized. Yet government's compliance with global norms, as we all know, is still wanting in many areas. We see forceful political backlash and backlash movements and experience regression in multiple ways, as Professor Adai, Professor Fishpan-Jaffe, and other scholars in this conference have mentioned. More importantly, in my view, our knowledge of the future and our vision for change remain unclear. The essence of my work, therefore, echoes the need to focus on equality as transformation. Among several findings, my study reveals that the concept of transformative equality is an emerging new global paradigm, which remains largely understudied. At the most basic level, transformative equality acknowledges the need for profound social changes in order to end discrimination against women. It is a fascinating idea that assumes that the main obstacle for change is that we continue to try and operate within a reality of gender societal structures of hierarchy which perpetuate women's inequality instead of aiming towards transforming them. In other words, we attempt to make women fit into certain conceptions and certain forms of institutions that are simply inadequate and essentially preserve inequalities. I thus developed the idea of transformative equality, showing its potential for allowing society to address contemporary challenges. I suggest, for example, engaging with what seems essential to me in this endeavor, that is studying possible futures and future challenges related to the advancement of gender equality. I also identify inter alia gaps and opportunities in the work of global institutions, explain how transformation can become a reality, and offer ways to motivate states to engage in transformative equality to achieve large-scale sustained change that is feasible and that would assure greater respect to gender equality. The research which I want to discuss with you today continues this important endeavor. It centers on the work of feminist and liberal religious movements around the world, especially in Muslim countries, in Europe, and in Israel. I argue that feminist religious reformers' work can greatly contribute to our understanding of the evolving, intriguing idea of transformative equality. I believe that the narratives of religious reformers and liberal religious movements teach us about transformation. As I see it, the idea of transformative equality should be based on their experiences in motivating reform and on similar gradual long-term societal processes. As scholars that examine the relationship between religion and state, whether in liberal or non-liberal countries, we all know that this intersection tends to be exceptionally thorny, as it involves issues at the core of a community's belief systems, that it generates intense social and political arguments implicating women's fundamental freedoms. Change in this area often seems unachievable, or at the very least a venture into a minefield. Coming from a religious family myself, however, I see the potential for progress. I witnessed the power of feminist religious narratives to bring about change in the most stable male hierarchies. The work of feminist religious reformers is transformative. They constantly critically assess, debate, and counter traditional discriminatory practices, whether they consider themselves reformist, traditional, orthodox, ultra-orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, or Christian. They reinterpret the most ancient rules, often working within their tradition's hermeneutic horizons to inspire ways for equality and justice. Reform branches are not only existent in all traditions and religions, but are also widespread and, as we all know, continue to grow. The reformative work and the narratives of religious feminists around the world that fundamentally challenge traditional hierarchies is, in my view, key to understanding the predicaments by which we can catalyze transformative equality. I earlier mentioned foundational gaps. One of them is particularly significant in this context. Asking the women question and developing this method to fit into the doctrine of international law, I examined international legal structures and found an inability to engage with and fully protect women's belief liberties. International standards concerning gender equality tend to be quite straightforward and not expressive of the diversity of ideas about equality and in religious contexts. As you all know, debates about religion and religious freedoms of women frequently involve different perspectives about gender equality and perhaps more subtle ways to promote it. Yet at the moment, international standards are not reflective of the complexity of discussions about equality and women's religious rights or protective of them. It is important for me to underscore that we operate within a very limited international legal framework. While the international legal system is broad in scope, it remains narrow in perspective, especially with respect to the rights of women. My past scholarship specifically examined the boundaries of the protection of women's right to freedom of religion or belief. First, let me stress this. The right to freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental right of every woman. It articulates women's freedom to follow their aims and beliefs, whichever those may be, and protects their personal autonomy to pursue their chosen faith, be it theistic, non-theistic, or atheistic. Put another way, the right to freedom of religion or belief guarantees a woman's right to believe or not to believe as her conscience leads, and to live by her belief openly, peacefully, and without fear, whether she chooses to uphold, challenge, or deny tradition. However trivial this description may sound, the regrettable fact is that women's belief liberties are a blind spot in international human rights law. Women's entitlement to this right is a widely deserted issue in international law. One of the first things to tackle is the need to address the term itself, women's belief liberties, which reflects a broader approach focused on belief rather than religion or religious freedom. Similar comments and notes in this vein were made by other, like Agar Lahav in this conference, and Nazila Ghana, who's not participant, but also mentioned this. What becomes clear from my analysis of hundreds of international documents is that during decades of progress in the recognition of women's rights, freedom of religion or belief has been viewed as an obstacle to women's advancement and as a threat to women's equal status in society. My research reveals that states are currently left to develop their own understandings with little oversight. From a domestic perspective, this creates an opportunity for states to either exploit the gap or develop national regimes that are detrimental to women. One of the major gaps that I have addressed is that the right of women to freedom of religion or belief has not been specified in CEDAW, in the Women's Convention. Political arguments between liberal and Muslim countries prevented the inclusion of the mere word religion or any of its variation in CEDAW. My work exposed and tackled the significant implications of this omission omission, namely that the CEDAW Committee, which is the primary global mechanism entrusted with the protection of women's rights, currently has no mandate to address this right or to supervise its implementation, and has not yet developed a general recommendation on the subject. The problem is that to date, the common global endeavor, as I said, remains to respond to the ways by which freedom of religion affects women. Global normative commentary that guides states is thus mostly directed at showing why religious freedom cannot be relied upon to justify violation of women's rights. However, my research shows that we need a transformational change, a transformational approach. The paradigmatic focus on the clash between religious freedoms and gender equality is in fact limiting the protection of women. The prevalent framing of religious freedom and women's rights as two opposite concepts is far from the reality of a matrix of different factors influencing the rights of women. Above all, it conceals the fact that women themselves are entitled to the protection, to be protected by the right to freedom of belief. In this regard, the perception of a conflict is pervasive and widely shared at the international level. A greater appreciation of the connectivity between the rights is crucially needed in order to properly address these matters in ways that focus on the variety of women's interests. My work thus urges a conceptual shift. It explains the interrelatedness between the rights, for example, marking freedom of choice and personal autonomy as core elements connecting them. I further offer, for example, to view CEDAW Convention and the CEDAW Committee as an appropriate site for developing the much needed tool for filling this void. I suggested a formulation of a new general recommendation on the subject, which would specify comprehensive standards for the protection of women's rights, bearing in mind the differences within women themselves and among women belonging to different communities. No doubt, we should break through the traditional boundaries of our perception of the right to freedom of religion or belief as solely threatening women's rights. International mechanism protecting women's belief liberties could tremendously contribute to ameliorating women's equal status. Tying everything together, I believe that securing women's belief liberties is the path for transformation. And above all, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, that religious reformers teach us about transformation. My work is dedicated to the challenge facing the international community in securing women's belief liberties and links this challenge to efforts to better understand the nature of transformative changes. Despite progress made, there remains an ambiguity regarding the ways to engage in transformative processes. It is widely unclear what work needs to be done to achieve such transformation. The prospect of clarifying some of the vagueness is the primary motivation of my work. In the context of this important conference, it is my goal to present my argument that the reformative work of religious feminist movements around the world, again, is key to understanding the predicaments by which we can catalyze transformative equality. Certainly, as we all know and witnessed in this conference, in recent years, there is a growing literature that explores efforts made by women activists in the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish worlds to reform their communities and confront fundamental construction of religion. I wanted to mention a few of the speakers, but I thought I'll just keep it general. Many prominent scholars, including those that spoke at this conference, show that liberal religious reformers have developed strategies to enable women to claim freedom and equality within the context of their normative community. Religious feminist reformers dismantle the most stable structures of hierarchy and gender-based dominance of our society and bring about change in many areas. While my past work focused on identifying the reformative practices of liberal religious reformers and showed that these bottom-up strategies and theories prove that religious liberties do not necessarily conflict with gender equality and also deserve special protection. My work today aims to link these efforts with the idea of transformative equality and to theorize their contribution. Reformers and reformer communities modes for motivating transformation and change show that local initiative can affect regional and global change. One of my key goals is to provide guidance and platform for reformers and for human rights scholars that would inform the work of human rights bodies, states, and relevant stakeholders. To conclude, I'm concluding. Manal. To conclude, on a personal note, I believe that the inclusion and empowerment of women through the right to freedom of belief is a necessary pragmatic antidote to the marginalization of women's beliefs and freedom of choice. The role of international law may not always be to resolve the tensions between women's rights and religious norms, but it can shift the terms of the debate in ways that place greater power in the hands of international bodies responsible for monitoring the implementation of women's rights and into the hands of those who seek to motivate transformation and implement global norms to allow women to freely pursue their beliefs. One thing is clear: feminist religious individuals have a role not only in their communities, but in society at large. They make a difference every single day. They tackle what seems impossible to confront. They have endless patience and incredible courage. They endure fierce objections from within their group and face hostility from outside as well. Yet they do not give up. Their faith enables them to thrive. Their determined spirit gives me hope and indeed can open the way to reimagining possibilities for change that would bring about a gender-just society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cochav. Okay, we're moving on. Dr. Rawia Aburabia. Rawia is an assistant professor of law at Sapir College. Rawia received her PhD from the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She received the Polanski Fellowship, the Honorable Extraordinary Polanski Fellowship for Postdoc at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Her book, Within the Law, Outside of Justice, Polygamy, Gendered Citizenship and Colonialism in the Israeli Law, will be published soon in Hebrew with Kibbutz HaMe'ochad publishers. The title of her presentation is The Law in Books versus the Law in Action, Muslim Women in a Polygamous Marriage Under the Jewish Law. Rawia, again, you have 15 minutes.
So, good evening, everyone. My lecture today is based on my PhD that dealt with polygamy. And polygamy is permitted under Sharia law governing personal status issues of Muslims in the state of Israel, notwithstanding its status as a prosecutable criminal offense according to Israeli penal code. In itself, the criminalization of polygamy by Israeli state law does not invalidate its legality in the eyes of, sorry, just one moment, I'm trying here. Okay, now it's better. Okay, the contradiction between the religious and criminal legal approaches to this issue is about coexisting legal orders. The relationship between Sharia law and Israeli criminal law raises questions about the place of religious, non-state law in modern state and its effect on the legal rights of Muslim women. Does this plurality favor Muslim women, or does it reinforce patriarchal values? Using 2008 to 2016 Bar-Ilan Sharia court records, sigil of ratification of customary polygamous marriage cases, I will illustrate how the Sharia court's actual practice combined with the government's policy of non-enforcement of anti-polygamy laws in Israel perpetuate patriarchal norms among the Bedouin. While this plurality and lack of enforcement enable Sharia courts to legally recognize second wives and their children, it harms the legal rights of first wives and their children and legitimizes polygamy as an accepted socio-legal practice. These paradoxes reflect the state-sponsored preservation of traditional and religious norms among the Bedouin in matters of personal status and constitute an integral part of the effort to keep the Bedouin as subjugated and isolated minority. By failing to enforce criminal prohibition against polygamy and by supplying the main means by which it's criminalized, the Sharia courts in Israel in practice recognize the validity and indeed the primacy of the customary Bedouin legal system, consolidate its role in enabling and encouraging polygamy among the Bedouin. It's not therefore merely non-enforcement as self-interested colonial practice, but an active regulator and facilitator of tribalism among the Bedouin. In fact, the autonomy of the Sharia court produces a legal culture that legitimizes polygamy as an accepted socio-legal practice, which entrap and expose Bedouin women even further. In Israel, in the case of Sharia courts in Israel, the Sharia court actually applied the most conservative version of Islamic law, which ratifies customary polygamous marriages without the required Sharia guarantee for equal treatment of the wife or allowing first wife to petition for divorce. Unlike the rest of the Arab world, the Muslim women in Israel whose husband decide to marry a second wife more legally vulnerable than their counterparts in the Arab world, the rights being neither guaranteed by the existing penal code nor by religious Sharia law. This, I argue, due to the colonially minded proxy controlled by the State of Israel over the Sharia court, a policy that had dire effects on the legal status of Bedouin women. So basically, my theoretical framework and my argument is that the non-intervention of the State of Israel in enforcing the prohibition against polygamy is a colonial practice. It's part of a colonial heritage in the legal structure of the State of Israel, but it's also part of settler colonialism. And I argue that the politics of polygamy is legally derivative from and consistent with the primary objective of assuring control over land and people in a settler colonial project. Polygamy both defines and maintains the perceptions of boundaries between the so-called modern Israeli state and backward Bedouin women. It evokes both as evidence of the harshness treatment of women in Bedouin culture, as well as the cornerstone of the case for the modernization, which includes uprooting Bedouin from their land and replacing them to recognized townships, a move which would not only grant access to basic facilities and essential services denied to the Bedouin, but also help save indigenous women from their oppressive male counterparts. As a settler colonial state, Israel prioritized holding land as the most coveted and therefore contested commodities in the interim of the slowly unfold seizure of land and the efforts to concentrate the Bedouin into governmental denied township and actually activate a system of indirect rule where it is enforcing and enhancing tribalism and customary legal system by ignoring polygamy when it's convenient. Now I would like to briefly describe my methodology. Actually, the objective was to eliminate the gap between the law and the books, the blanket criminal ban against polygamy and the law in action, Sharia court's actual recorded practice. I analyzed polygamy marital cases recorded in Sharia records in Beersheba. I sampled 3,150 individual marriage cases, and I will show you briefly. Okay, so based on textual analysis and quantitative survey of the polygamy cases, I will provide with the brief time that I have an example or maybe two examples that will illustrate the ways in which the court routinely register and ratify customary polygamous marriage despite its illegality, and in some cases actually encouraging the practice of polygamy by Sharia court judges. The examples actually that I will show will demonstrate the way in which the Bedouin customary legal system proceeds and directs the subsequent action taken by the Sharia court and the legal and the political environment that the state cultivate that enable and encourage the spread of polygamy among the Bedouin. I didn't mention that according to my research, 30% of the Bedouin households are polygamous. According to the state data, updated state data, it's almost 20% of the Bedouin household, and it is the higher percentage actually in the Middle East. I mean, which is kind of a dissonance or a paradox. And both the interpretation and the practice of Sharia law within the state, a situation that is unique to Israel. In most state-run legal system in Muslim majority countries, a number of different religious faction interpretative school, legal tradition, and active religious institution jointly share the responsibility to interpret the Sharia and collectively participate in determining a manner of its application. In the absence of well-established and officially recognized mufti or ulama, religious scholars, Abu Ramadan claims that the Israeli legal field is better described as judge-made law rather than jurist law, as was originally intended in classic Islamic jurisprudence. The state of affairs is also abetted by continued use of outdated legal frameworks and codes originating over a century ago. So we have the Ottoman family law of 1917, the Qadi Pasha Code of 1975, the Majallat al-Ahkam the Books of Rules of Justice, which is the codification of the Islamic principles applicable to the Sharia courts in Israel based on the Hanafi school, which is the school that is dominant in Israel-Palestine, and the Ottoman Code of Civil Procedures of 1879 that are all still applicable today in the Sharia courts in Israel with no significant changes or amendments. The Sharia court, so let's, okay. So I want to say a few things about Ottoman laws and polygamy in particular, because it's important to demonstrate the gaps between the law on the books and its actual implementation. So we have the Code of Personal Status by Muhammad Qadri Pasha that restricted the maximum number of wives a man may be wed to simultaneously to 4. We have Article 152 to 159 that established the regulations meant to ensure equality between the wives, requiring the husband to provide equal and adequate financial support and accommodation to each wife and her children. And of course, it's forbid discrimination among wives on the basis of temporary physical or psychological impairments such as illness, invalidity, etc. The Ottoman law of family rights bound the man to treat his wife with equality and fairness. And of course, we could interpret that. And the most important thing with this law that is still applicable in Sharia court today is Article 38 that asserts the wife's right to insist on a monogamy clause in her marriage contract, prohibiting her husband from marrying another wife as long as their marriage endures. Okay. So I categorized the requested legal aid, but I will only focus on, I think, maybe one, I want to focus on 2 category. We have the category of ratification of customary polygamy and ratification of polygamy matrimony and acknowledgement of the kinship ties. I would want to say something about the way that the ratification of customary polygamy and actually the invisibility of women and children as a result of this ratification. So the majority of cases that I looked at that brought before the Sharia court of Elisheva were cases in which the plaintiffs seek retroactive recognition of marriage originally conducted in customary Bedouin legal system, ORF, Since this customary legal system is valid and practiced among the Bedouin, it is important to consider the difference between the Islamic and customary approaches to polygamous marriage. According to Islam, a marriage may be considered valid when a proposal of marriage, ijab, has been formally accepted, qubul, in the presence of two witnesses. The parties themselves, the groom and the bride, must each voice their consent in the match. Customary marriage, by contrast, is officiated in a public wedding ceremony that is not necessarily commemorated by any kind of written record. It should be emphasized that because they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, customary marriage could be considered valid according to Sharia law. The validation of a particular marriage agreement is, however, at the sole prerogative of the Qadi. Of the 2,000 cases that I analyzed, only a fraction, 64 cases, were administered in the presence of an official clerk, official clerk from the Sharia court, the Ma'zoon, and recording in writing. None of these were polygamists. This meant that the overwhelming majority of polygamy cases that recorded in Sharia courts in Beersheba were first conducted under the customary system by customary marriage officiant, and which means that the customary system is valid, and afterwards it brought to a formal ratification of Sharia court. It should be also mentioned that the Qadi ratifies this marriage and issues a marriage certificate, as the records will show. And I would like to show you here something, because about for years the Israeli official and state were arguing to not enforce the criminal prohibition over polygamy because there were not any evidence. And here is the evidence, formal Sharia court records, which stated here the personal status of the bride and groom, and stated here that personal status of the groom here is married, and here we have the women, Palestinian from Tul Karem, that is divorced, and here we have the proof. So if the state would like to enforce the criminal prohibition, it could have done so. Okay, so this is a typical way of the way that the ratification of customary polygamy is taken place. The main things here is Article 148 of the Qadri Pasha Code and Article 79 of the Majelle, which constitute the heart of the procedural part. And there is like a typical quotation: if a man acknowledges a woman as his wife, if it establishes that there is no Sharia impediment that would have prevented her from marrying him, if he doesn't have more than 4 wives, including her, and if she accepts his recognition and she doesn't otherwise have a husband, nor was she in a period, the marriage would be considered valid, and he is obliged to provide her maintenance, and she is entitled to inherit from him. Due to time, I cannot provide you with further examples as of the way that the judge, Sharia court judge, is actually helping men to avoid the criminal prohibition. He is also not warning the parties that it is a criminal prohibition. He only started to do so in a very selective way in 2016. And I would like to conclude so I could respect time. So the finding, and this is really just a small portion of the finding of this research, basically demonstrate how the state's lack of intervention in the issue of the personal matter of polygamy perpetuates patriarchal norms among the Bedouin under the auspices of colonial legal structure. I showed how the complexity of legally recognized polygamous marriage, the recognition that legitimizes polygamy as an accepted socio-legal practice and de facto strips first wives of their legal rights. These women are deprived of any legal recourse and offered no mechanism for redress and compensation. Thus, they become virtually invisible in the eyes of the various legal systems. This lack of the legal protection is confounded by the multi-pronged discrimination facing the Arab-Palestinian minority in Israel, ultimately aggravating the political subjugation of Bedouin women by revoking their ability to extricate themselves from oppressive households and marriages. The lack of enforcement of criminal codes against polygamy, coupled with the Qadi's unprecedented jurisdiction to interpret and apply Sharia law, reinforce the fissure between the law on the books and the law in action. The Sharia court records provide insight into the multiple forces at play within the Sharia courts, operating as an organ of the state, but also firmly rooted in the customary tradition of the Bedouin community. The Sharia court of Beersheba selectively applies Ottoman law, cherry-picking only those articles which sanction ratification of polygamous marriage and overlook those that ensure fair and equal treatment of wives, or that allow Qadi to use the court hearing as an opportunity to educate single women of the protections afforded to them before being married. This selective application, the Sharia court's abstention from warning of the criminal prohibition against polygamy and the lack of its enforcement, trapped Bedouin women in the gaps between the legal system and severely curtailed their rights as Israeli citizens, as Muslim women, and as human beings. The practice of polygamy and its routine ratification affect the legal status of Bedouin women and give a legal aspect to the interlocking spheres of marginalization to which they are subjected by virtue of being women in a patriarchal tribal society as part of an ethnic minority in a Jewish state. The invisibility and exclusion are enabled and reinforced by the state's colonial framework of control that preserve traditional and religious norms among the Bedouin and constitute an integral part of the effort to subjugate and isolate them as a minority. Thank you.
We're moving on to Dr. Elisheva Rosman. Elisheva is a senior lecturer at the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University. Her research focuses on civil military religion and the military. She served as a member of the Municipal Religious Council of Efrat and as the head of Ritual Bath Committee. Her presentation is titled Choosing Battles, Religious Feminists, Expectations vis-a-vis the State. Elisheva.
Okay, so good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I don't know what it is for everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers, especially for inviting me, but also for a very, very successful conference. All the presentations have been extremely interesting, and I think you'll see from my presentation that I've really been listening and a lot to learn. So Professor Hadelin Kadali opened the conference by saying that religious feminism has perhaps become the most formidable feminist force today. And Professor Wudud spoke about how she feels that Lord's statement about using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house still holds. Dr. Yoshai, just in the previous panel, also brought up exactly this point. And what I'd like to suggest is that religious feminism is perhaps more successful in using the master's tools, just like Ronit suggested, because it does so using the prism that Professor Ross spoke about during her keynote speech, that we're speaking of engaged critics who are not naive, but rather understand the boundaries and rules and use them to create change, accepting that lo alai chamich, it is not up to you to succeed alone, and change is an ongoing process. It doesn't come about through single actors. I think most of the presentations that we've heard today and in the previous days have really shown this. But there are tools, and some of the master's tools can be used, they can be adapted, they can be reshaped, and change can actually happen. So during my talk today, I'd like to present a typology that I think, I can't think of the word this minute, sort of converses also with what Lisa brought up in the previous panel, and also from what Dr. Alenat also spoke about what I'd like to do today is present a typology of strategies religious feminists use when they deal with the religious establishment and what expectations they have from the state in each of the categories of this typology, where the state fits into this equation. So Manal introduced me as a political scientist. It's what I am. I can't pretend that I'm not. It's an evolving field. And I think you've also seen that from the other presentations that we've heard today, how evolving it really is. I won't go into my methodology because of time constraints, but if you'd like to, we can during the Q&A. I think that we've seen also in all the previous presentation that there might be some merit to sort of zooming out and looking at what we've been hearing the past 3 days from maybe a little bit of a different perspective. And I'd like to suggest tools and also a different perspective of looking at things, different lens through which to view the various conversations that we've been having over these days. When we see change, when we examine religious feminists, what are we looking at? What do they use? When do they use what they use? Where does the state fit into all of this? And as we already know, the Israeli case is very interesting and everyone's been using it, so I'm going to use it as well. And also, since I'm the very last presentation and everyone is tired, I would like to do it through using 3 short examples. The examples will illustrate the typology, and then I can flesh out whatever I haven't brought in to the examples themselves. So, as most of you know, Israel has mandatory conscription for Jewish men and women. As a rule, religious women are granted exemptions, although most Zionist religious women opt for civilian service for either 1 or 2 years. However, religious women have always served in the military, even before 1948, but it was considered conduct unbecoming. It's not right for a religious woman to serve in the military. And there were always religious, social penalties for serving in the military. In the late 1990s, a program was instituted to enable religious women to serve within a more protected framework. So the Garin program, the nuclei program, enabled women to study religious studies, which is what you're seeing here, and enlist together in what we term pink collar jobs, jobs that are more acceptable for women, either education or instruction, and in a more supervised environment. As you can see from the way they're dressed here, their entire lifestyle is more accommodated when they enlist through this sort of program. Now, what the women who are within these programs are basically doing is bargaining with patriarchy, Denise Candioti, which many of you know. They are willing to enlist in the military, perhaps with less interesting jobs, less challenging jobs, and within a more protected framework, in more supervised roles. And in exchange, their social group will view them as good Jewish women. They're still within the fold. Now, in this case, they have an expectation from the state. They expect the state to enable the change that they've constructed. So to ensure that these programs continue, to ensure that the military respects their way of life. The second example, private rabbinic divorce courts. And yesterday, Nitzan, who is here in the picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor, was here, but I don't know if she's here today. As we've heard during earlier presentations, today as well, the entire issue of personal status in Israel is decided by religious frameworks, and we're talking about the Ottoman millet system. And this has basically been the topic of today's discussion, I think, in all of our panels, and the issue of divorce as well. The woman you see here in the picture, Tzvia Grodsky, was married to a man named Meir. They did not have a very good marriage. It was very violent. In 1998, she filed for divorce, and he refused to grant her a get. In 2001, the rabbinical court put him in prison, hoping that this would sort of stimulate him to divorce her, sort of along the lines of what we heard Judge Hale speaking of yesterday. And it didn't really help. In 2018, and I'm reminding you that she filed for divorce in 1998, a private religious court was called together by the Center for Women's Justice, represented here by Nitan Kaspi Shiloni, and the court annulled their marriage using halachic tools in order to do so. This was done again in 2020, the second picture. All in all, there were 3 such cases until today. It's a precedent for having a private rabbinical court dissolve a marriage that the official rabbinical court of Israel was unable to dissolve. Now, in this case, religious feminists are using a term coined by Susan Sered, revolt, which is not to be confused with rebellion. Rebellion is when religious feminists say, or in general, feminists can say, the system is okay. We have no problem with the system. But those who are running the system, who are in charge, are misinterpreting the way the system should be run. And therefore, we don't accept the actors, we do accept the system. What's happening in private rabbinical courts, but private divorce courts, is not this. It is questioning the entire system. The system is corrupt. There is a problem with the system. We want to remove the system and institute a new system instead, not the official rabbinical courts, but rather private divorce courts that we are instituting on our own. Now, in the case of revolt, the system must be changed. The expectation from the state is to recognize the alternative. So if one day these women want to be married, remarried again, the expectation is that the state will see this divorce done privately as binding. Now, Nitan spoke at my class a few months ago, and if she were here, she wouldn't agree with my interpretation, but I still stand by it, and during the Q&A, if you like, we can discuss it. Going back to rebellion, saying that the system is okay, but those who are running the system are the problem, the actors are the problem, the situation is not, the system is not the problem, the expectation from the state is not to interfere. And this ties in very nicely with many of the examples we've heard, including having women as rabbinic decisors, including both the things that Professor Boudou and both the things that Professor Ross spoke about on the first day of the conference during the keynote. When the religious feminists are working within the system, having the state as an external actor interfere is not going to further any cause. Actually, it might even be detrimental. And therefore, religious feminists prefer that the state keep their hands away from the situation and abstain from acting. Third example that I'd like to bring is a new term, leveraging, and concerns the issue of ritual baths in Israel again. In 2015, a number of women in Jerusalem petitioned the Supreme Court in Israel with the help of Itim to allow them to immerse alone in mikvaot, ritual baths. Now, Orthodox Jewish women cannot run a Jewish home without the use of the ritual bath, and it corresponds with their reproductive cycles in many different ways. But it is imperative. You cannot have an Orthodox household without some relationship with the mikveh. So these women wanted to immerse without the bath attendant, the balanit, interfering with their use of the bath. Now, the bath attendant is a gatekeeper. She decides who can immerse and how they can do it, how they can prepare themselves, and so on. The petitioners argued that they pay their taxes, and therefore, since it is a public institution, they should be allowed to use the bath the way that they want. The Ministry for Religious Affairs realized pretty early that it wouldn't be able to protect its position in court, and it withdrew. It said that it would allow the women to immerse the way they requested to do so, and therefore the Religious Council in Jerusalem also retreated and the women won. Now, in this case, we're talking about a strategy that I would like to call leveraging, whereas, and this is actually a new form, although I'm sure that you recognize that it's been used in many other countries and in many other situations, using the state in order to force the religious authorities to do something they don't want to do. And unlike bargaining, there is no trade-off. The women aren't offering a trade-off in exchange for the rights that they're demanding. They want their rights, and that's it. And in this case, the expectation from the state is to protect their rights. These women say, we are citizens, this is a democracy. You have no choice, you the state, but to protect us, please do so. Now that I've given you these three sort of anecdotes, I'd like to talk about the two at the sort of extreme, well, not really extreme, but the two strategies at the far ends of the spectrum, exit and acceptance. So when religious feminists accept, they are accepting the current situation, either because they agree with it, it is the proper and right thing to do, and I accept it, or because they have no hope for change. It's not what I want, but I'm never going to be able to win this battle, so I'm not going to even fight it. In exit, the women are saying, are exiting. They're no longer part either of orthodoxy or of their religion. They move to a different religion, or of religion in general. They have lost their belief. They're no longer part of this framework called religious feminism. And in both these cases, the expectation from the state is no real expectation, because if religious feminists are accepting that the situation is, this is the way it is, there's no expectation from the state to do anything. And if they've left the fold of religious feminism, then they have other expectations from the state that have nothing to do with the equation that we're discussing here. So these are sort of meta categories for strategies. And I think you've already realized as I'm speaking that they can be broken down further. And I'm sure that listening to the other presentations, you can also see that they must be broken down further in order to explain things in a better way. So for instance, if we're talking about acceptance, we can talk about negative acceptance and positive acceptance. Positive because I think that this is the way it's supposed to be, and negative, I don't like the way it is, but this is what I have and this is how I'm going to manage. Where can we go from here? So of course, trying to understand the typology better and work out the subcategories is of course something very important. Another thing that we don't have time for is to discuss these strategies in a more comparative aspect, through a more comparative lens, looking at other religions, looking at other countries. I really see how the other presentations here have shown this. So to conclude, this is really a work in progress and a beginning, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm moving on to our respondent, Dr. Tanya Sion Waldox. I hope that I pronounced your family name correctly. Tanya is a lecturer in the Seymour Fox School of Education at the Hebrew University. She is a gender scholar, feminist activist, and a mother of 4. This is a really nice information that no one adds in her bio. Tanya is fascinated by the intersection of religion, gender, and politics with a focus on social change. Her current research explores feminist activism and women's political subjectivities in religious communities or traditional contexts in Israel, examined through qualitative studies with a comparative lens. So, Tanya, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open by thanking the organizers of the conference and bringing together a wonderful array of speakers and topics, especially given the unique challenges that we're all experiencing together and apart during this pandemic. So kol hakavod and mabruk. And thank you also to all 4 speakers in this session for your rich and thought-provoking contributions to the panel. I'm honored to be able to discuss the papers with you. And I apologize in advance that I'll speak as quickly as I can so that I can get as much in 10 minutes, and after we are all tired after 3 hours of Zoom. So before I address each paper individually, I want to highlight some common elements which I think are important to make note of. Each of the papers examined the context of women's lives and how structures shape obstacles and opportunities for social change. We heard about multiple legal, political, and cultural contexts or institutions and how they interact and how the different positionings within them, for example, in relation to the Jewish state, which came up for many of the speakers, how they affect each group of women differently as religious subjects, as women, and as citizens. The importance of putting social phenomena in the context here is that it reminds us to examine not only gendered hierarchies, but also how they intersect with other modes of power and identity, race, ethnicity, religion, nationality. And I would like to suggest that in all of these cases, we also need to ask what the terms religion and feminism mean and how we can situate them better in each specific context. Because many of the papers also juxtaposed different case studies and looked at multiple structures and overlapping contexts, it also encourages us to examine the contradictions, the elisions, and the shared interests. And I think this is important because many cases, this is where the worst damage occurs for women. They get trapped in multi-level oppression, but it's also where the most creative solutions may arise as women code switch or use resources from one context to maneuver more flexibly within another. What I would have loved to hear more and was missing in all the papers is about yourselves and how we as feminist researchers also put ourselves in context and perhaps can be more reflective about our own standpoint and our own perspective and engagement with the material that we're studying. Finally, the last point that I think is really interesting and that all the comments, all the papers brought up was that it's very important to name the dynamics, and many of the papers name dynamics that are purposely vague or hidden or in flux and changing, and trying to identify strategies, whether it's strategies of oppression or strategies of change and transformation, allows us to name what is missing, what is unrecognized, what is omitted, what is normalized and naturalized, what is embedded in action but not yet conceptualized. And I think in that sense, these are the new things that we've learned. So I'll try very briefly to respond to each of the papers, and I'll say this just to the speakers if you like. I have it written out more in more detail, and I'm happy to send it to you later. So Dr. Alenat Abed reminds us of the importance of reflecting on how academic knowledge production is itself a product of politics. And she reminds us also that women's increased participation in the public sphere is not synonymous with feminist activism or even advancing emancipatory politics. Salwa provides us with an important historic narrative of how women, Muslim women, grew their active participation within the Islamic movement. And from my own perspective, it left me wondering about how this history can be read through the larger context of Palestinian society in Israel and non-religious trends as well. And it also highlights the need for more histories of women's involvement in religious movements within the Jewish sector, women's involvement in religious movements that are not necessarily feminist or emancipatory. I found it particularly interesting that beyond engagement with religious practice, knowledge, values, leadership, Dr. Abed Alenat also put an emphasis on addressing women's daily needs, improving their life, poverty, education, domestic life. And this also seems a really important point to consider, since in comparison with Jewish religious women's participation, we rarely study what we think of as women's issues that are not deemed as religious issues. And this has to do with the mostly unspoken ethnic and socioeconomic characteristics of what is considered religious or orthodox feminism in Israel, where most of the daily hardships and economic struggles are left out of the purview of the more Ashkenazi middle class religious feminist struggles. And so I think that the Muslim case here is very important, and the juxtaposition teaches us a lot. I would have also wanted to hear more about the split between the northern and southern movements. What's the nature of each of these movements, how the dynamics between them, including Israel's intervention by outlawing the northern branch, how that affects the women, what led to the different types of roles the women create within each, etc. I wanted to know more about the meeting between academically trained women and the grassroots networks, how these different identities and worlds interact, what new resources are created. This also might be interesting because of what's happening today in the Haredi world, which seems to be moving in that direction as well. More generally, the questions of these women's national politics, their civic identities, their complex relationships with Israeli law and Israeli sovereignty, Israeli institutions, what do they gain, what do they lose within this precarious position? And how precarious is it? What do they actually risk? Finally, in terms of this paper, I'd like to focus on what your main argument was, this issue of the strategies or the religious principles. And I wanted to ask, are matching, hiding, and rejecting, which are the three principles that you suggested, are these religious or theological principles? Are they cultural ideals? Are they practical political maxims? Who determines what should be hidden and what the boundaries of matching or integration are? How is this negotiated, and what is the role of women as opposed to men within this negotiation? And finally, I want to ask you or encourage you to answer the following question, which is, what do you imagine the next stage will be? As you describe the different stages and how they've developed, I'm wondering what you imagine the next stage to be, both in terms of intentional and perhaps unintentional outcomes of these women as they come into power and they come into their own space. So thank you very much. The second paper by Dr. Cochav Elkayam-Levy really, I think, helped us remind us about the importance of the implications of omission. What happens when the right of women to freedom or religious belief is omitted from the international documents and from the international doctrines? And often what is not said, what is not named, is no less harmful and sometimes even more potent than what is clearly articulated, as feminist theorists have already shown us. That which cannot be named is often harder to resist and harder to fight and harder to critique. So thank you for that important contribution. Your research also reminds us to ask basic questions about what exactly is worthy of protection? What are these laws meant to do? Who are we protecting, and who falls outside of that protection? And the research also focuses on the interactionist view, how local initiatives can affect regional and global change and vice versa. Specifically, one of the things that you seem to be focusing on is this idea of transformative equality. And I felt there's an ongoing tension that I want to encourage you to continue thinking about between speaking about these kinds of changes that you're examining as radical change that require reimagining and rewriting the rules of the game, but also then giving examples of women who are, by their nature and by their commitments, reformist and motivated to continue and hold on to the game as it is and the rules as they are. And so it would be interesting to analyze the obstacles and the resources that they have to create such deep set transformation, but also acceptance of certain structures. And that goes also to this idea of liberal religious reformers. I think we need to think more deeply about the connection between liberalism, religion, and reform. To what extent does liberalism and religion truly engage, and how do we recognize the limits of their engagement? To what extent does working within liberal values or structures limit the extent of feminist reform that can be done, whether within religion or outside of religion? Unless liberalism's own patriarchal foundations come under scrutiny and its secularist assumptions are examined, I think it's very hard to imagine that liberalism will save religious women. And finally, my question to you, Cochav, is I'd like to hear more about how you envision the role and the limitations of international law, not to resolve, as you say yourself, but to guide or even impose or empower certain elements within these local struggles. What is the danger here, given that international bodies are also set within cultural traditions and power relations? They're also set by certain assumptions. So how do we make sure that they don't overvoice and basically create another level of oppression for women within their own cultures? I have two more speakers, so I'll do it really quickly. Dr. Rawia Aburabia, really like Cochav, Rawia focuses on multiple legal systems and how they interact. And I think what's really important in this is that she also reminds us about the interlocking interests of power, which makes us question whether there can even be a presumption that there is a desire to protect these women and their bodies, or whether maybe, and you didn't say this, but you hinted to it, the current situation reflects a concern for a different national body, which it must be protected, and the women are the victims of this. It also raises the important question of what is truly legal and for whom, shattering the assumption that we are all subject equally to the rule of the same law, examining the mechanisms of differential application of the law, right? What is the law on the books as opposed to what is the laws really happening? I think especially these days, these questions are very, very fascinating and pertinent. And I think in this case, it's also interesting to ask on a scholarly level, what are the hierarchies and power dynamics that are behind these policies? And on an activist level, the question then becomes, how do we make the state more accountable and more accountable for its implicit choices and interventions or its lack of interventions? And I'm struck particularly by how your examination of these harmful and powerfully oppressive legal norms are basically encapsulated in paperwork, in routine ratifications. The great drama of women's pain is hidden within these mundane bureaucratic practices, which I think research like yours requires us to expose and then make the state more accountable for. And my question to you is, how do you imagine a way to disentangle this situation? You gave a great analysis of the problem and the oppression, but what, if anything, could change it? What are the pressure points? Where do you suggest leveraging or changing? Either what you think is most politically efficacious or what you think the most just way would be to do. From what subject position or within which claims framework do you think this problem could be best transformed? And finally, Dr. Elisheva Rosman aims to classify and categorize the strategies used by religious feminists, particularly in relation to the state. And I think this kind of project is perfectly timed. Now that we have 3 decades of such activism under our belt and the movement itself continues to change, it becomes more established, more diversified, but also in some ways it remains stuck. It's important to zoom out and to try to see what the overarching perspective can tell us. I would argue that the state has also changed, not just the movement, and that more nuance should be invested in recognizing the different facets of the state and how it can both impede and enhance the kind of transformation that these women seek. In that sense, I really applaud your endeavor to outline strategies and typologies. I think that some more nuance has to be introduced, and you say it's a work in progress in terms of the terms that you use. The general term religious women or religious feminists need to be questioned. The state needs to be questioned, and elements need to be more clearly differentiated because we know the state is invested in Jewish religion. There are also religious actors acting within the state. The state is often not a disinterested actor. It's not always an external actor. Sometimes it's an internal actor. So all of these, I think, need to be taken into account. And also the use of categorizations like revolt or rebellion. It's important to notice that these are not emic categories. As you yourself said, if I said this back, some of the women who work in this field would say, no, that is not what we're doing. So I think that when we as researchers use these kinds of categories, we need to be reflective about what are the ideological assumptions that these terms rely on, right? What are we saying about these women and why, and what happens to their voice when they say, no, I'm not revolting, I'm not rebelling, I'm actually continuing, I'm actually loyal to tradition, I'm actually backed up by precedents. And then ask additional questions. Who and what is being revolted against? What does it mean to revolt? What is lost and what is gained? What are the long-term implications? The same thing about exit. I don't think that exit is binary. What does it mean? Are we leaving institutions? Are we leaving social, affective, ideological ties? That private and public here are very mixed. So questions of voice and questions of exit are not binary. And I think I encourage you to continue delving into creating this, this theory. And finally, my question to you is, how does this kind of typology, how do you imagine it moving us forward? Beyond describing or sorting them, what do they teach us that we didn't know before? How can we use this to understand multiple different case studies, perhaps beyond the Jewish and Israeli case? How do I use them to understand dynamics and change, identify different pressures and different opportunities, and not just label things? And when you said in your title that this is about choosing battles, how do these typologies help us to choose battles? And who is this us that is trying to choose the battles? Thank you so much. And I really would love to hear your responses, but also see these works continue to develop.
Wow, thank you very much, Tanya. I think that's what we're going to do is, after your excellent response, I think that it will be wise just to let the presenters, the researchers, to address your comments, your questions, and maybe I will give each one of you about 4 minutes, and you can address Tanya's comments, please. Would that work? And then if we will have a little bit of time, I will have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. So Salwa, do you want to start? We'll go as we started before.
Thank you, Tanya, for your response. Indeed, you, in this very short presentation, I can't deal with all of these questions, but the presentation is based on my doctorate research, and I talk about for example, the split of the Islamic movement. There is many reasons for that, ideological reasons and also religious reasons. It's also about the split is differences how to react or how to deal with the Israeli system. Okay, there is different approaches for that. The northern approach or branch believe more in separating or building a mujtama' Islami, independent society, Palestinian society in Israel, and the southern faction believe more in integration and being a political player in the Israeli political game So, and one of the differences between them is how each other deal with the elections, especially to the Knesset elections. So it's very deep differences between the two elections, and this is also affect the members of the Islamic movement. It affects also the women, and women, they were not a part of the decision to split, but the split itself affects their works, their dawah, affects their also families. You know, from the stories of the women, I learned more about how the split also go inside their families. And sometimes they have to deal with that because the discussions and the differences was so deep between wife, between in the same family, between wife and husband. Sometimes the husband is from the northern faction or northern branch, his wife from the other branch, and sometimes these differences make sometimes problems between the couples. Also, we can talk about the competitive competition between the two activists in the two branches. So the split is it's very אירוע מכונן. It's an event. It's that very influencer, have many influences on the female activists in Israel. I accept your notes. I think I have just some minutes to deal with them. I accept them about the principles. Yes, the principles, for example, I deal with this, or I present these principles, Musayara, Tawriya, Vibara. Some of them, for example, Bara has a religious root. It's Wala Bara. Its basis very principles who is very basic in the Islamic religion. So I took this, for example, this principle in order to deal or to talk about the women who difference, who want to show that we are different. We are not part of the Israeli society. We are bara. We reject the regime. We look at Israel as a colonial state. We see Palestine as a waqf, as a religious land for the Muslims. So bara, for example, it's part of the religion principles. So when women take this principle and practice it by rejecting Israel, so there is connection, and I accept your note that I have to make it more. I have to explain it more, and okay. So
thank you very much.
Okay.
Salwa, thank you very much. Cochav?
Yes. So first of all, Tanya, I thought your comments were brilliant and excellent. I think just reflecting on myself, and I try to do it when I write and in my articles, it's important to say that I was a lawyer for the government, and I had to advise on international norms and to find ways to translate it to actual actions and policies. And I think this brought really a practical perspective to my scholarships to try to really bring these global standards to the ground. And this is where I found that there is really, I think the silence, you mentioned the silence, and I think the silence in this area is really louder than everything that I witnessed. So I'll just give a few examples. When I had to write the report, the government report, Israel's report to CEDAW, you actually go one by one, article by article, and reporting on the situation of women, or on the situation of the right to health and the right to work, and then there isn't a right to freedom of religion or belief, and then of course there is the Human Rights Committee and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But then you see how different mechanisms in the UN have developed different terminology. So I didn't have enough time to explore everything that my research showed, but definitely this is one part of my work. And I want to say, you asked about the role of international law. I want to say that later I worked with NGOs, and then also as a scholar, I think I saw the potential of international law to really influence states' actions and to motivate change and to inspire activists around the world. And so this is my motivation. And I think you are right, there's always this balance between how much to elaborate and how elaborative can be the global standards can be, but still, I think in this case, there isn't much. And there isn't enough, of course, as I emphasized. You mentioned the name dynamics and how I think my hardest work was to find these invisible concept, really to understand what is going on. And I think this is one of the things that I did in my scholarship, is to name this phenomena as the women and religion conflict syndrome. And I explained how it comes about in the international legal framework. And you're right that it's really one of, I think, major contribution, or at least a large part of my research. So, and I want to say also about seeing what you mentioned, looking beyond the dichotomies. Also, I dedicate a lot of my work to show the interrelatedness between gender equality efforts and belief liberties. I mentioned just briefly that I show that the women's right to the freedom of choice and also personal autonomy are core elements, and also the identity. I also point to identity aspects that are similar in women as a group and religion as identification of a group, and how really placing these rights in opposite ends is just wrong, and it makes no sense. And so I point to this tension.
How can you conclude in a sentence, please?
Yes, of course. And I of course note and know all the problems with liberalism, and Yofi Ross mentioned it yesterday. I think it is problematic in its exception and in its expectation of religious women, and of course the public-private dichotomies. But I want to say that I mentioned it very generally to point to movements that aspire to bring equality and to promote women's equal status. So thank you so much.
Okay, Rawia, can you just please also address Nomi Gert's question?
Yes, Nomi and also Deborah wrote me apparently that we are both dealing with polygamy. So we should continue talking, Deborah, but I would just say that Dorothy wrote me privately about how it affects children. Of course, children are also victims of this practice, and actually the work of Lian Krenawe and others, the Slonim, addressed the psychological impact of polygamy and how it's affect women and children and how they are suffer from it psychologically. And my work focused on the legal aspect and actually provide evidence and documentation how this ratification is taking place and how these gaps reinforcing patriarchy by strengthening a customary legal system. But to your question, Tanya, thank you for your comments and question, but I just started teaching family law at the Sapir College, and most of what I'm teaching actually related to rabbinical courses. Most of the presidents brought to Supreme Court, it's about Jewish, and I'm astonished to see. I told my student, if there is something that we can draw from Sharia and rabbinical court, that a religious court could be equally oppressive to women. And I know that some of you might pose such a provocative statement, because as we know, we could also change from within using Sharia or halachic or whatever to change. But still, I think the situation in Israel, we have two levels, the level, the political level, the colonial level. We need first to decolonize the space so it will be more equal to women. We need to go to, although it sounds a cliche, but to separate state and religion must, and allow women that want to marry and divorce and to exit this religious platform to do so. I'm not saying we should dismantle religious courts, but we have to have other options. And I cannot, also in my research, disconnect it from the political, from decolonizing the space, but from for the pragmatic, practical, and activist standpoint. And I also a feminist activist, and came as I was a practicing lawyer. We know that a few years ago, there was an inter-ministerial committee headed by Amy Palmont, Minister of Justice, that was supposed to deal with the problem of polygamy. It actually was after years of activism and feminist voices from the Palestinian community. And you have also here, so Bana Shouri, that was also part of this vocal voices that called the state to interfere. But eventually, unfortunately, when we examine the recommendation of this committee, we see that, for instance, one of the recommendation was to expand the authority of the Sharia court and grant them more power actually to ratify polygamous marriage in the cases that are not even based on Sharia, actually strengthening customary law. And when I went to the Knesset, and I was also, I wrote op-eds, and I also talked to Amy Palmore and told her why we came as feminists, as Palestinians, as Muslims, and say, fight this practice. First, you have in the committee, one is that is bigamist, as kind of this, let's balance, to bring bigamists in this committee, but why to do that? And then I realized that actually it's the cultural ceiling for Bedouin women. It's not the same, or the equality, or what you refer to, Tanya, as what is the legal framework, and from whom, what is the national body of law, and from whom, and that is the question. That's I think that we need to continue to ask for strict supervision of Sharia court, and not agree for less to be less equal than any other women in the state, and to compromise on our legal rights. So, and if you're more interested, I wrote actually about this and more. I could circulate my paper that is specifically on not just on theory, but on practice, what to do with such a phenomenon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elisheva.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Of course, I agree with everything you said.
That's easy.
Yeah, it's very easy. Because first of all, I think that it was obvious from what I said that I agreed with what she said even before she said it. For sure, everything. First of all, when the idea that what the women themselves do and how we as researchers interpret it. So I didn't explain it properly. When Nitzan Kaspi Shiloni, when we discussed what the private courts do, she, on the one hand, was much more militant than what Revolt tries to do. But on the other hand, her expectations from the state were not exactly in vain, because she felt that there was really no hope, that it was there was no way that anything was going to happen. And I won't go into everything that she said then. But it sort of ties into my methodology, because part of my methodology is really to speak to the activists. And you're absolutely right that it's very, very important, because that's really how we learn how they interpret their experiences and what they see and how the state sees them and so on. I hope that one day I'll have enough money to actually do this in a more comprehensive way and not in between the other projects that I'm dealing with. And also, as far as all the definitions go, yes, I did build upon the fact that we are in Mishpacha Chama ve'ohevet. Everyone here sort of knows what we're talking about, and I didn't go into all the definitions, although if I were presenting at a different conference, I would start with the definitions. So you're right on that as well. What do we learn from this and what does it teach us? I think here it ties in again to what Ronit said in the end of the last session. So if we're talking about master's tools, religious feminism teaches us a lot more about using the master's tools vis-a-vis the master's house, I think, more than secular feminism, or in tandem with secular feminism, but it has something to teach secular feminism. And in that, first of all, religious feminism isn't afraid of using the master's tools. And I think that that's one of the things that I learned from my research. Not only is it not afraid, but it's also not completely clear that religious feminism wants to take apart the master's house. Maybe it wants to move around the furniture. Maybe it wants to take down the inner walls and change the way the inside looks. Maybe it wants to add on another section to the house, but it doesn't necessarily want to dismantle the house completely. It wants to renovate it in a different way. And I think that that's a true contribution that religious feminism makes to feminism in general. I think it's very clear from the past 3 days. And that it can use the master's tools to do it. So how exactly, I still don't know, because I'm still working on it. But I think that's something that I at least take from everything that I've heard in these past 2 days, but also specifically from the research that I'm trying to do right now. So I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you everyone for an amazing session. I just have two things to say, and then I'll give the floor to Ruti and Ronit to conclude the conference. Well, I was wondering after Salwa's presentation about the stand of Muslim women regarding integration in the Israeli society, whether after having these 3 days of this very important conference, how we can think about integrating the three feminist activists and religious women all together. I was wondering if we will find in the near future a religious, maybe feminist, a political party of Jewish and Arab women, of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish women. Would that be a kind of integration that would be acceptable for the different women involved? I was also wondering, I keep on, when I hear problems, I jump up straight away to thinking about solutions. So Rawia, can we think can women judges in the Sharia court or in civil courts would make things better, would change the situation? Jewish and Muslim women in the civil courts, in the Sharia courts, it's impossible, obviously. But I was wondering if we can take out of this conference something of integration of L'Shalev Yadayim, just holding hands and moving on together, and thinking of a more integrative vision rather than being activists separately in different areas. So just this is my input, my comment to this session. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm thanking the 5 amazing researchers that just presented very amazing presentations, and thank you for the organizers for the very enriching conference. Ruti and Ronit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manal.
Thank you very much, Manal. Well, it's unbelievable, but the month of preparation just ended in 3 days. It's really hard to believe. I would like, honestly, to thank all of you for sharing with us your thoughts, your research, your ideas. Actually, some of you stayed with us the entire 3 days, and it's highly appreciated. I would like to mention that all lectures will be put on the websites, both of the Rachman Center website and the Gender Studies program website in a few weeks, being translated both to Hebrew and Arabic. So you will be able to listen again and to learn more about the presentations. I truly hope that we will have the chance to meet you in person, and please be in touch. And thank you very much for participating with us. Ruti?
Okay, thank you, Ronit. And like Ronit said, it's really unbelievable that we have come to the end of this conference, and it's more than a few months, Ronit. I think our time, perception of time has been completely skewed in these 12 months. We started planning this conference way before COVID, as I said, BC, before COVID, before Corona. And we finally realized that it has to move to the virtual sphere. And as I said, even though today, unfortunately, we did experience difficulties, and I really apologize for them beyond our control. But the big advantage of this virtual sphere is that we could have today Deborah here staying with us, Lisa Fishbein yesterday and today. We could have Amina Wadud on the first day. I mean, and I won't go into all the names of the participants from out of the country, 3 continents. It's really incredible. And for those who could not participate, we will have all the sessions posted online. And I repeat, invite everybody to visit the incredible exhibition curated by Nurit Jacob-Zinon and David Sperber. And again, thank you for all the participants. This last session, the one before, were really amazing. All 3 days, we could not have hoped for better participants, such high quality, intense presentations. So I really thank each and every one of you for all the effort that you put in preparing them. Thank you, Tom, for doing such incredible work behind the scenes. Karen also putting such huge efforts, night and day, overcoming all the last-minute obstacles. Thank you to the gender program at Bar-Ilan University and for the Open University for this wonderful collaboration. And I do hope that it is just a beginning of collaboration. Like Manal said in her concluding remarks of this session, hopefully, maybe we can take from this conference a view, hope for more collaboration, more cooperation between we women, us, from the three different religions of the Abrahamic faiths. We've seen how much mutual concerns, strategies, ideas, challenges we have in common. So maybe we can put all this in the future for more work together. So once again, thank you everybody, and most of all, thank you to Esther and Romy Tager from London, who've accompanied us throughout these 3 days. Truly grateful for your generous support, without whom this, of course, could not have been done. So we'll see you, hopefully in person, sooner than later. Yeah. God bless.
Bye all.